Our next speaker, of course, is our founder and the visionary for the World Justice Project, our president and CEO, Bill Neukom, who will give an overview of the World Justice Project.
Thank you, William. Let me add my welcome. We appreciate you very busy folks making time to come here and learn with us and to make us better at what we're trying to do. This World Justice Project is just beginning its 6th year of existence. We are still in many ways a startup. Maybe we're approaching early adolescence as an enterprise. We are emphatically aware of the fact that what we're doing is audacious and may sound sophomoric, but we think we're at a stage in our development where we have begun to find some returns on our investments, and that's because we've been able to attract the attention of folk like you and to get your best thinking so that we can find new ways to propel ourselves towards our mission. And we don't seem to have the remote working on the slide deck. There's that. Good. Let's see if we can get it here on my poor man's teleprompter. Apparently not. Context. And here I am intimidated because any one of you could draw a better set of these contextual points than I, but from one person's perspective, what are the ingredients of the geopolitical landscape in which we find ourselves today? Well, you start with Mother Nature, it seems to me. And Mother Nature has her own way. We can propose, and Mother normally disposes. There's global warming or climate issues. We can disagree about what the nature of them is and their extent and what we might expect from them, but certainly we are more aware than ever of climate challenges that affects human life and other kinds of life on this planet. Natural resource consumption. You've all seen the statistics. Europe is using up about 150% of the natural resources available to it. The United States is doubling that. We are using up 300% of the natural resources available to us. Those are a couple of curves that can't continue to go in that direction. Divided communities. We're all, I'm afraid, painfully and acutely aware of the division in our communities, local, in this country, state, regional, national, international. The economic gap is only getting wider and deeper. It's not 99% and 1%. It's much more graphic, even melodramatic than that. And it's getting worse. And the consequences are enormous, as we all know. Medical services disparities. Health is pretty important in this life of ours. And one of the unfortunate consequences of the gap in the economic circumstances of folks all around the world is the disparity in medical services, a lack of access to medical services just for the basics, whether it's prenatal or whether it's an acute illness that could be life-threatening or disabling. Partisan governments. We are here in Washington, D.C., in some ways the unfortunate poster child of governments too often based on ideologies and an unwillingness to compromise and try to find what is in the common good, where the ideologically perfect gets in the way of the best interests of the governed. Lack of trust in government institutions is what's fallen out of that, I'm afraid. If you look just a little bit below the surface, I think you will find governments wary, increasingly wary as they should be, about whether they have a role of trust and competence in the minds of the folks that they're supposed to be serving. More challenges. Social unrest. We've heard about the Arab Spring. There are examples all over the world. I would posit respectfully that what we saw in the Middle East, North Africa in the last year or so is fully capable, in fact likely, of happening in other regions of this world. It's because people are desperate in too much of the world. They're desperate for change. What they want is some reasonable set of opportunities for economic advancement and for a fair and accessible government. It's a shrinking globe. That is an all too obvious statement, but what happens in Cairo, Egypt, matters day to day in Cairo, Illinois. Very different communities, a long distance apart. They are connected in very vital ways. Just things like fuel for tractors in Illinois, and many others. We have probably too much attention paid on bilateral relationships and bilateral diplomacy, if you will, and cooperation, not enough on multilateral. This country, I think, has devoted itself much too much to the former and not enough to the latter. That's changing somewhat with this administration, apparently. But still, in terms of a theme and how we're going to get things done, isn't it obvious that there have to be more alliances and there has to be a more inclusive approach to resolving disputes between nations and to helping nations provide their folks with opportunity and equity? And there is, throughout the world, I'm afraid, a kind of ambiguous and in many cases immature jurisprudence. What are the rules of business? What are the rules of government? What are the rules of engagement? How is it people are supposed to plan their work, plan their lives, plan their families? It is all pretty vague, and it is still early in its development, and that makes it very difficult for folks to make plans, makes it very difficult for folks to help each other. And part of the shrinking globe phenomenon, of course, is an unstable but very interconnected global economy. There's good news that offsets, at least to some extent, those challenges, isn't there? These are some of the things that come to mind. We have a vastly expanding knowledge base. You've all seen the slope of the curves. We create more knowledge every year than we used to create in a decade or in a century. It's on an accelerating pace. If that knowledge, if that information is of quality, we stand to benefit from it in terms of making more informed, rational decisions and moving civilization forward. We have new means of communication. We all saw the pictures from Egypt and understand what social networking has done to some of those grassroots efforts. Again, so long as it's viewed as a tool and used wisely, it can be a force for the positive. Useful technology in various forms, computing power, robotics. Robotics are in our lives. They're in our factories. They're going to be in our homes sooner than later. Energy alternatives, thank goodness, are important. And isn't it a powerful message that so many of the energy companies are being wise and leading the movement towards energy alternatives? And of course, medical advances. Time is our friend with medical advances, to be sure. Women in the workplace, indeed people of color and women in the workplace, is a huge additive towards efficiency and productivity around the world, whether you're in public or in private work. Transdisciplinary higher education. Maybe this country does this better than most others, but the notion that law students should be in classes with computer engineering folk, as well as business students, as well as political science students and teachers. The world's problems are solvable the way they never were before because of the technology that we have. But it takes not just interdisciplinary, but transdisciplinary study and planning and strategy and execution of strategy. President at Stanford talks about finding a cure for cancer and HIV/AIDS within the lifetime of his students. He talks about finding a way to have sustainable peace within the lifetime of his students. He talks about finding a way to balance a sound environment with the energy needs, the resource needs of the growing population. All of those things within the lifetime of, if not his faculty, his students. And the way it's going to happen is because of teamwork, transdisciplinary learning. And finally, there is the human spirit. You all wouldn't be here if you weren't optimists. Realists, but optimists. And there is something about us. We have a dark side, and that's what the rule of law protects against, and we have a bright side. And people are yearning to have their freedom and to have their opportunities. So with that as a landscape, what is it that we're trying to do with the World Justice Project? And we're based upon two premises. The lead premise is that if any of us wants to live or work in a community of opportunity and equity, we have to have as a foundation in that community a concept called the rule of law. It's more than a concept, it's a system of the rule of law. And what we mean by opportunity is some economic opportunity. We are agnostic about the form of that economy, but some way that folks can have a job, some way that folks can, through dint of their ability, applied abilities, can grow wealth. And in terms of equity, we mean by that an accountable government under a set of fair laws, a government which is fair and accessible. And we think that the validity of that premise is self-evident. I invite you to look at this morning's Washington Post or Wall Street Journal or Financial Times or New York Times and look at the stories in the main news section and ask yourself how many of those stories have beneath them somewhere, if it's a bad story, the lack of the rule of law. Whether it's a public hospital pancaking in a natural disaster because of the corruption in materials and building codes, whether it's atrocities against women and children in Central Africa, whether it is a government which is making itself wealthy while it's impoverishing its people. Story after story after story keeps coming back to the root of a lack of the rule of law. We have choices we can make, and here are some examples. There are ways of doing business and ways of doing business. And I think that the world's a better place when we're doing business in an open and on the merits, arm's length basis. Engineering. We can have buildings that collapse. We can have well-designed and well-built buildings, classrooms, hospitals, churches, all of the homes, the kinds of things that are fundamentally important for shelter and productivity. The environment. We can create and maintain a healthy environment, or we can suffer the disadvantages of a befouled environment. Two forms of government. They're even more graphic illustrations of a government which is based on ideas or a government which is based on force, in some cases personal force. Human rights. This is a particularly telling rendering. I think that it's Tiananmen Square on the left, and it was Tahrir on the right, but this was in the spring. And the Cairo Square on the right looks a little more like the one on the left recently, doesn't it? How quickly things can change. Labor. There's manual labor. There are people who are smart and work with their hands. They should have a fair break. There's the media that informs the public, that keeps us vigilant about our government and about ourselves. We have choices about medicine. We have choices about the kind of military we're going to have. Military leaders are increasingly saying that the number one thing they have to understand is the rule of law. They have to know the people in the theater that they're trying to protect or defend against. And of course, public safety. So those are the kinds of choices we have to make. And our trailing premise, if you will, is that if there's validity to that lead premise and we insist, if you will, respectfully, that there is validity to it, what can you do about it? And we think what you can do about it is to harness the talent and the energy of our colleagues in all walks of work, other work disciplines. It's not the rule of lawyers and judges. You can't be a faith leader, you can't be an educator and teach and discover. You can't do business, you can't have a sound public health system, you can't have a reasonable balance between energy and conservation, you can't have a healthy arts community, you can't have responsible public safety and a military. You can't do any of those things at all well if you don't have a stable rule of law foundation underneath you. So our message is we're all stakeholders, and we want to continue to be more and more interdisciplinary as well as international as we pursue our mission. These are the four universal principles that make up our notion of the rule of law. It's a very dilute concept. As you know, there's probably literally thousands of different uses, or I would say abuses of the term the rule of law. Our definition is based on, or our understanding of it is based upon these four universal principles. They can be applied, we believe, in any community, however underdeveloped its economy may be, however informal its government might be. And it starts with a government which is accountable, whose agents and officials are accountable as well under a set of rules and laws. And the second universal principle is that not just any set of rules and laws. We know about apartheid South Africa. We know about the Third Reich. Those were very law-bound communities. It's got to be a set of laws which meet some minimum conditions, effectively just laws. They have to be clear so that you don't have a law degree to know what they say. They've got to be publicized. They've got to be stable. And they have to treat protection of the individual, property rights, and a core set of human rights. Those are the laws under which the government and its officials should be held accountable. Thirdly, the process by which those laws and rules and regulations are adopted in the first instance, the way that they are administered, all that bureaucracy where most of us have our contact with the law, the way they're enforced by courts and law enforcement officers, that's got to be a system which meets the minimum standards as well. And essentially, it's got to be a due process, if you will. It's got to be accessible to folks. It's got to be fair, and it's got to be efficient. And finally, there has to be dispute resolution between umpires and advocates, if you will. However, again, informal or formal, the system where those folks are competent to do what they do as advocates or decision makers, where they have adequate resources to do their work, where they represent the communities in which they work, where they are ethical and independent of public or private influence other than evidence and the merits of the proceeding. In addition, when we think about what we're doing, we think in terms of just three main goals. The first is educational, if you will, to find a way to evangelize our notion of the rule of law so that folks understand what we mean by it and its fundamental importance, and in turn how it is relevant to what they're trying to accomplish in their communities all around the world. And the second of our goals is government reform. The most powerful examples are a direct response from a government that finds itself not in adherence to the rule of law under our index and seeks to do something about it, to improve its performance. Again, not for the sake of scoring better with us, but for the sake of better serving its population. And thirdly, we work hard at incubating a lot of practical on-the-ground programs designed and executed by a group of folks from different work disciplines, which those programs can enhance and extend the rule of law in that particular community. So those are our goals. And we have three lines of business, or three initiatives, if you will. Research and scholarship, the rule of law index, about which you'll hear in just a moment, and mainstreaming, or if you will, the incubating of these practical programs. This is the scholarship. We're blessed by having launched with the help of the American Bar Foundation, the research side of the ABA, and that was Bob Nelson there. Margaret Levy is currently our lead scholar. We have had works written by Nobel laureates Jim Heckman and Amartya Sen, among others. We thought we had to have an intellectual cornerstone. If we're going to stand up in a meeting like this and say to you, this is what we mean by the rule of law, this is why it's relevant, join us and help us do something about this, people could wonder whether that lead premise was valid. They have sought to prove through their research and writing the validity of that lead premise, that there is a connection between communities of opportunity and equity and the rule of law. And there's a second round of that research and scholarship which will come out in a matter of months. Our second line of work is what we call mainstreaming. This is the incubating, inspiring folks, if necessary, provoking folks to design and then execute these practical on-the-ground programs. And we do that by bringing people to these regional meetings, and we do it increasingly, hope, by dint of our website and people communicating through the internet about ideas for programs. And these are just a couple of examples of them. We have in Sierra Leone an example where the statute that protected women's rights across the board was in just one language in a country of 4 official languages. This group on its own, after coming to a meeting of ours, translated those statutes into the other 3 languages and took that message out to the elders in the countryside so that women, for the first time in Sierra Leone, had an understanding that they had property rights and they had protection against domestic violence and they had rights in the case of a divorce, for example. We have an urban poor effort going in India, where there are enormous populations of poor folks there who don't understand what their rights are vis-a-vis their government. I mentioned earlier the construction situation. We're working with the World Federation of Engineering Organizations who are up in arms about the corruption they see and the negative outfall from all the corruption that happens in construction projects around the world, indigenous workers' rights in China, and counterterrorism in the rule of law, largely in the Western Europe and the United States. Those are just examples, if you will, of the kinds of projects that we have been able to encourage. Finally, and perhaps in some ways most importantly, the Rule of Law Index, which is why you're here today. This is a diagnostic tool. We attempt by means of this to measure adherence to the rule of law under the general understanding of our 4 universal principles. You will hear a lot about this momentarily. We've currently measured 66 countries, 85% of the world's population. We'll expand that by another 30 countries next year, by which time we will have measured about 98% of the world's population, and we want to measure those countries over time, a year or 2 later, to see if progress has been made or if they are regressing. This information has proved very powerful to a range of audiences: governments, businesses, civil society, academicians, and the like. And finally, our business plan involves this kind of synergy, if you will, or this reinforcement among our 3 initiatives. It's pretty obvious that scholars can provide ideas for projects. The folks at the mainstreaming can, in turn, suggest topics for scholarly analysis. And over here on the right, the index shows opportunities for reform for the mainstreaming projects, and the mainstreaming meetings like this one serve as a beta test site, if you will, for the index, both its methodology and its content. And finally, down here, the scholars are just salivating for this data, which they've never had before, the index, and they use it in their work, and in turn, they obviously advise the rule of law index experts in making sure it's as good and valid a product as possible. So that's who we are, and just to top off the audacity of it all, what we seek to be is this sort of perpetual motion machine, throwing off useful, reliable, current data and stimulating literally tens of thousands of practical programs which can, in their own way, cumulatively change the rule of law in country after country. Thanks for your attention.